Comparative politics, take 1. I should have said like take 12. Okay, so your book, the wonderful Michael J. Roskin's 13th edition of Countries, Concepts, Politics, Geography, and Culture. The title is a little unwieldy, a little long, but it is really comprehensive. And I think it is a really good indication of what is in the book. Because very oftentimes, things like geography are in fact going to impact the political culture of a country. In fact, there are some theorists who will go so far as to say that geography entirely determines the political form your country takes. I'm thinking here people like Diamond, if you've read him. He's a very popular one, very accessible. So, comparative politics. We're in a subfield. So here is the glorious field of political science, right? So here is political science, and now we have the subfields, right? So we have like international relations, right? And comparative politics is one of these as well. Now remember, international relations is the study of relations between states. Comparative politics is the study of what is going on within states. I had mentioned the idea of like pool balls. International relations often talks about states like they're these inscrutable little pool balls. We don't know what's going on inside of them, and it doesn't really matter because it's really their position on the table which will determine how they interact with one another. Comparative politics looks at why states behave the way they do. And of course, some of you might be saying, well, excuse me, doesn't that then impact how they interact with other states? So doesn't this obviously impact interaction? I would say yes. And I would say that's part of why a lot of international relations theory gets things wrong, is because they don't take a look at what's going on inside the pool balls. That is not, that's just like a blanket statement. Obviously there are some schools that take account of what we call public choice theory, why public actors make the decisions that they do. And we're going to get into that when we talk about the incentive structures that people face in office. Okay, so, comparative politics. Several things to talk about here that they want you to know about. The first is they sort of chop the countries into two different sides here. They've got authoritarian states, or non-democratic or dictatorial polities, or democratic ones. Now, democratic ones, of course, mass participation, competitive elections. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. Obviously, we could pick this apart and point to in-between systems, right, where there are elements of each, and we will look at that. For example, Iran has elections. Would we say that Iran, though, is a thriving liberal democracy? No, that's because democracy is procedural. Democracy is relatively non-ideological, right? Democracy is just a process by which the majority of the votes win the contest, right? It says nothing about the policies that government will then pursue, right? If the majority of people in the United States vote that we're going to invade Canada, right? That's not a very peace-loving, liberal thing to do. But that's the thing is, democracies need not be liberal. They need not be liberal. They need not respect the rule of law, individual rights, civil liberties, etc. So I want to actually jump to another page here real quick and talk about some words that I really think should come right up front, because they're used all the time and oftentimes interchangeably. State and the nation. You've all heard these words, right? You've also probably heard this word that I really hate called country. Country. Now, country has no scholastic use, really. We don't want to use the word country. I know it says countries, concepts, and whatnot, but just ignore that for a second. It will make sense. Country is just a shorthand for when we're wanting to talk about these things, these big blocks on the map. But really, we have states, which are the major territorial political subunit of the globe. This is just me saying that there are spaces on the map with borders drawn like this that are internationally recognized, right? Don't even ask me what I'm drawing here. Let's just pretend these are all very recognizable countries. Can't you tell this is Italy and France and Germany, right? And these are the states. These are the bounded territorial units that we call states. These are geographic. You can point to them on the map, etc. Nation. Nation. A nation is a group of people who are bound together by one of several, or individually or separately, of the following characteristics. Things like language, ethnicity, religion, family ties. All of these things make up nation, right? So you can have nations without states. Who here can give me an example of a people, a nation, who don't have a state?
Like the Kurds?
The Kurds. Beautiful. That's exactly the example I was going to use. Yes, the Kurds, the poor Kurds. The Kurdish people, who go all the way back to the Crusader period, right? When you talk about Saladin and the Third Crusade and stuff, like, we're talking about Kurdish warriors here. But unfortunately for the Kurds, their population is kind of stuck between Syria and Iraq, and so they're not all together. They're all split up into these other states, right? That's a great example. That's a great example. So we have nations. So these are people who have the same ethnicity, same language, people like the Kurds, a history of being together. And then you have the states. The states, these are just the territorial subunits. Now, when these two things coincide, you have nation states. That is when the people, the nation, has a state that is for them. The primary language of the French nation is French. That is why the official government of the state of France is French, right? And the culture of the French state is French, right? So I hope that makes sense. Okay, so we're going to talk about nations, we're going to talk about states, because oftentimes states, even nation states, will have ethnic minorities. There will be other peoples inside those states, right? A great example of that is the former Yugoslavia. Who here, the Balkans, in Europe, in southeast Europe there, right above Greece, there was a state there called Yugoslavia. And you were all Yugoslavs, you were South Slavs. But actually, there were Bosniaks, there were Muslim Bosniaks, there were Catholic Croats, there were Orthodox Slovenes, there were Orthodox Serbs. And the state broke up in a series of horrible, bloody, violent ethnic clashes. And now we have Bosnia, we have Montenegro, we have Croatia, Slovenia, Serbia. You have the ethnic Albanian enclave of Kosovo inside of Serbia. So these things can get very messy because there was this progressive idea in the 19th century. So how did we get here? I'm going to erase this for just a moment. Actually, permanent. If you want me to, I will put it back up. And so the word country, again, the word country, this is just something that we use colloquially. Colloquially, that just means it's like a common figure of speech. We just say country, and people kind of generally know what you mean. But here in this class, when we're talking about it, we want to talk about the actions of states or of the nations inside the states. So we want to kind of shy away from using the word country if we can. So how did we get to this point? So, modern period begins in about 1500, right? And at this point, Europe is just coming out of the late medieval, I have to spell this right or Dr. Jack will haunt me. Didn't. Okay. He was a professor I had here at Spring Arbor, and he was a medievalist, and he had a coffee cup, and it had all the different ways that people commonly misspell medieval. And so, okay, there you go, Dr. Jack. He's up at Michigan now, I believe. So, coming out of the late medieval period, we didn't have nation states. What you had were kingdoms, right? You didn't have France, right? You didn't even have a French. You didn't even have a French people. You had a kingdom of France, which was the personal property of the king of France. And all of the lands, there was, for example, the Duchy of Aquitaine, the Duchy of Burgundy, the Duchy of Normandy. These were lands which had been granted in perpetuity to loyal vassals, right? So you're, a good, strong guy, got a lot of retainers with you. If you pledge your loyalty to me, I will, grant you and your sons these lands in perpetuity. And, just whenever we decide to go fight the English or anyone else, and I call for soldiers, you have to provide them for me. That's how taxes were levied originally. Taxes weren't paid in, money or something. Taxes were, you were supposed to show up with your guys to, go fight. And then gradually, as gunpowder weapons begin to displace medieval-type armies, kings started just asking for money so they could, go buy guns and gunpowder and ships. Kingdom of France. That is important, but I'll get to that. Kingdom of France. So, the people of France did not think of themselves as French. There wasn't even a French language. The language that we call French today was spoken by just a small number of people. Here's Paris. Okay, gosh. All right, here's France. Sorry. I'm not great at drawing. Okay, just pretend this is France. Okay, here's Paris, right? Here's Paris. Okay, and this is where the king of France is. King of France is very weak, by the way. He's totally reliant on his lords to do what they're supposed to, and oftentimes they don't. This little area right here, that's who's speaking quote-unquote French. Parisian French is what we call that, okay? Otherwise, you had people speaking Occitan, Breton. You had people speaking all kinds of languages. To this very day, there are over 1 million Provençal speakers in France, in modern France. So, these people who lived, there is actually a whole body of literature that talks about this move from peoples to nations. Nations have to be made. We're moving out of this medieval period where we have all these peoples whose livelihoods and livings are entirely local. You probably never left the town you grew up in, unless you got, unfortunately, drafted into the army, and then you probably died. So people would hide their sons and stuff. They did not want to be drafted in the army. So you have these peoples whose lives are entirely local, kinship, small community stuff. Europe is often referred to during this period as Christendom. Because that's really the only tie that they have. They all speak entirely different languages. If you are living in Gascony down here, that's where D'Artagnan was from the Three Musketeers, by the way, fun fact. If you're living down there, what the King of France says is virtually irrelevant to you. Because the real boss is whoever the Duke is in here. And if he chooses to do what the king says, okay, then maybe you'll have to do something, but he might not. He might choose to ignore him, and the king can't do anything. So, there is a period, though, of centralization that starts to happen. 1500. Okay, what happened in 1492? 1492, what is he talking about? I promise, if you look at chapter 1, this will all make sense. But none of you did, so you have to trust me. Okay, 1492. What happened in 1492? Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Excellent mnemonic device. Okay, all right. 1492. Now, what happened in 1492? Columbus sails the ocean blue. All of a sudden, the Iberian monarchs get filthy rich very quickly, right? These medieval kings, I already told you, they're very weak, hopelessly weak. They have to beg their lords to do what they're supposed to, right? And oftentimes, he had to grant them things. I really need some troops, Duke of Normandy. He'd be like, well, gosh, awfully hard up at the moment. What do you say we make some share of my lands tax exempt, forever? And I'd be like, okay, fine, whatever, I really need some troops. And gradually this eroded the king's taxing power. This is a problem that all the monarchs have. And they do this over the centuries. Obviously, France is a big area, right? So it takes them a long time to give away these taxing privileges. But by 1789, the year of the French Revolution, the king is super hard up for money. He is basically, it's actually his ancestors had done this. King Louis XVI hadn't really done much of that. He was a terrible king, but most of it wasn't really his fault. Anyway, he can't tax his nobles. He can't tax his church, and the church and the nobility is where all the money is. So he's just forced to try and squeeze the peasantry. And so the kings of Spain, the reason I say that about taxing power, you need to fight wars, right? That is what states do with each other. They fight wars over territory, right? Over resources. You need taxes to do that, and you need nobles to agree to do that. Nobles are not super keen to fight for you, though, for obvious reasons. You have to go away from your estates, you might die, your retainers might die, they're difficult to replace, they're costly to train and arm, etc., etc. What's in it for me is usually what you're asking. When the Iberian monarchs were going across, this is the Atlantic Ocean. Now we're in South America. Oh my goodness, guess what we found in South America? Tons of silver. All of a sudden, the Iberian monarchs don't need to squabble with their nobles to beg them for money. They can just take some money from the South American colonies and use it to go on huge military boondoggles, right? Like the Spanish Armada. Who's heard of the Spanish Armada, right? That Protestant wind that smashes the ships. Yes, okay. Yeah, that's how he was paying for that stuff, right? And just getting lines of credit because they have this inflow of money coming in. Most of the monarchs did not have access to that. And so what they had to do was engage in a series of centralizing moves where they would essentially trade different privileges for more power and authority. And so you enter this period, so you have the medieval king, who is very weak. They need to build consensus among their nobles. They need to power share. This is about in the year 1500. We're coming out of the Middle Ages, remember? Or out of the medieval period. Going up to here, into the 1600s and 1700s, you get this period known as absolutism. Absolutism. This is a few hundred-year period where these European monarchs are trying to destroy the power of their nobility to centralize the power for themselves. Okay? So, again, I'm going to draw a terrible version of France. I really need to get like some large cutouts so I can trace. Paris. So remember, you have all these different provinces, right? You have all these different provinces, and these are the personal possessions of the guys you grant them to. So you don't have any control over what goes on in there once you grant them away. So yeah, maybe in the moment it was a good deal because you needed this guy's loyalty to fight this war so that you didn't lose your kingdom or something like that. But now, like, you can't really get taxes out of that area. You can't really do anything there. You can't enforce laws in that area. You're relying on them. They run the local courts and all that stuff and all the tax collection. So what they want to do is they want to take away all that power. They want to replace these nobles who are in control. They want to leave the nobles in place, but they want them to be more like figureheads. They want the actual administration of the taxing apparatus, of the enforcement apparatus, of the courts to be run by professional bureaucrats whose loyalty is not to the local lord, is to the king. So this is a process that takes, like I said, we're talking about a process that goes on for centuries. It's incremental increases in central power here, losing a little bit there, gaining a little bit more there. Gradually, over the centuries, this is what happens. And so what the big process that's driving this formation of centralized bureaucratic states, okay, is war. There's a very famous book about European state formation written by a fellow named Charles Tilly. A very famous book. If you go to graduate school and study this stuff, you'll almost certainly have to read it. He says right up front that war made the state, and the state made war. That it's just this recursive process. That it was war making, the need to more effectively make war, that drove this centralizing process. And that once you have these ever more powerful states, that this power tends to want to continue to expand. And so they just sort of make more war as a consequence of doing this. And I think there's a great deal to that. That's probably oversimplifying things, but it is very catchy aphorism nonetheless. And I think it captures something very true. It was war making that did this. So that is how the states were formed. these highly bureaucratic centralized states. The nation-making process that goes on during this time, again, we had peoples, highly diverse. Highly diverse. Life was very local. You spoke your local language. If you were living in, what's it called? Shoot. Savoy, if you're living in Savoy down here, and you tried to travel up here to Normandy, you'd pass through several different language zones where like you couldn't understand anything anyone was saying, and they couldn't understand you. If you were growing wine over here in the Bordeaux region, and you had some excess wine, had a nice crop this year, and I can't sell it all here in town, I want to take it over to the next province or whatnot and sell it, or take it to the port and sell it, you would have to cross so many different, I'm going to call them custom zones, but every little locality had their own taxing power. So it's like, oh, you want to go across our bridge? Pay up. Okay, you want to pass through our town? Pay up. It didn't make sense for you to try and grow your business and expand because it would all get gobbled up in taxes. You couldn't take it to other markets. So these were huge impediments to the growth of capital, of business, of wealth. And so one of the things that these centralizing monarchs want to do is tear all that stuff down. To say, no, you guys are not going to make your own regulations. I'm going to make the regulations. And then once I have all the money, I'll give you a cut. Now you can see probably why the locals were a little bit resistant to this. Like, oh, I'm sure we'll get a cut. If you waste it all on war, which is usually what happened. But, okay, so, bring the peoples together. Again, we want to make war more effectively. The French Revolution is a great example of this. 1789. Okay, 1789. The French Revolution. The new French government, the Republican government, wants to arm the population. This is a super radical idea because previously to this, if you were a monarch, you did not want to arm your people, right? That would be very dangerous. They might very well come after you. You had an army specifically to put down your people if they rebelled, which they often did. You know, the history of Europe from like 1400 onward to there is like peasant rebellion, send in the army, kill a bunch of them. But, you can't kill them all because then who would work and grow the food? That is where that comes from. So, but in 1789, the French government, the revolutionary French government, starts to feel in danger of being attacked by Austria, by Prussia, these other neighboring monarchical states. So they arm the population, and they start standardizing everything throughout the country. Meaning that, you think about it, orders need to go out from Paris. Are you going to stop to take time to make sure that it gets translated into all these different languages? No, you're going to send officials who can read and speak Parisian French into these areas, and you are simply going to give orders and directions in this way. And people who want to rise within the new system will get on board and learn to speak the new languages, right? They start sending out public school teachers, right? To start educating the youth, building a conscious nation, a homogeneous nation. So we're going from heterogeneity, highly diverse, your identity markers are all local, your local priest, your local lord, your local bishop, to being more about the national government. I am one of millions of French people, rather than being like one of 500 people in this village, or being a Savoyard, or, yes?
With the U.S. not having an official, one declared language, do we fall under that category of a nation?
So the United States is interesting, and we're going to talk about this here shortly, because what we're talking about here is the difference between integral nationalism and what we call civic nationalism. So you're right, the United States does not have an ethnicity or race or religion with which it is officially associated, or even an official language. Actually, English was very nearly made its official language in the 1880s. I think it fell by like one vote. But yeah, so that's a great question. The United States nation, its nationalism is civic, what we call civic nationalism, which I'm going to talk about shortly. So good question. Yes, and so this drastically increased the war-making capacity of the state. In World War I, when the Austro-Hungarian Empire was trying to fight, most of its officers were Austrian nobles. That meant they spoke German. However, they were commanding commoner troops who were Slovenes, who were Croats, who were Galician Poles, who were Ukrainian. And so oftentimes these officers couldn't communicate with their troops, and they were having to like pantomime what they wanted them to do. And so very oftentimes, as dusk fell and they couldn't see their officers anymore, just, discipline would break down and, there'd be a horrible slaughter. So, it's helpful to be able to speak the same language as your troops, basically. And this is something that they had figured out quite early. So that's the process. So the state wanted to make a nation, right? We have these states, these centralized bureaucratic states, and they want to then turn around and create a nation. They want to standardize the language, they want to standardize the taxation, they want to standardize the regulations, all in order to increase the power of the state. And I'm not going to get into this stuff, but there's all sorts of really, the 19th century is when all this stuff is happening. This is when Germany is created, this is when Italy is created, this is when Bulgaria, Serbia, this is when all these states are literally created, self-consciously created. And there's all sorts of very interesting stuff where they talk about the need to increase state power. And that, liberalism and stuff like that should just go by the wayside. Individual rights, choice, all that stuff. If it interferes with increasing the power of the state, we can't allow that to happen. Because Europe in the 19th century and early 20th century was a pretty rough neighborhood. Spoiler alert. Yeah. Who here? Yeah, you guys know what's up. Do they require you to take a history course here, an American, a world history course or anything like that? Yeah. Okay, so that's it. That's how we got to nation states, and then of course, this is one of the last things I'm going to say about this because I just want to get us up to speed with where we are. So these European nation states, which were in existence by the mid-19th century, definitely by the mid-19th century. You can take some of them further back than that, the English state for sure. By the way, just historical notation-wise, when I'm talking about the 19th century, I'm talking about the 1800s, right? When I'm talking about the 15th century, I'm talking about the 1400s, just in case anyone is unclear about that. Okay, so these European states start spreading out looking for colonial possessions, right? Because they want to be able to monopolize and dominate raw materials to keep them inside of their little trading networks, right? And then they would keep other states out, right? So you wanted to have your own supplies of rubber, ammonia, all those different things, right? Well, what happens is a lot of times the Europeans would draw their boundaries in ways that just group people together who were not ethno-linguistically homogeneous at all. Sometimes they would do this on purpose as a means of divide and conquer, divide and rule, right? So then you can balance these different competing groups off against each other. Other times they just did it without even caring or knowing or realizing what was going on. But basically what you wind up having happen here is by the by the 20th century, by the early 20th century, you have the world basically broken up into all of these recognizable territorial boundaries, okay? And when the European empires fall apart, these just stay in place. For example, the African states, there was a big African Union, they got together and they said, look, now that we are getting our independence from the British and from the Dutch and from the British and French, we know that these boundaries are very wacky and we're not drawn very sensibly, but if we start messing with the boundaries, this could provoke all kinds of war. We're just going to leave them in place. And so that is part of what has led to a lot of the problems there. In India, the British basically took all these different peoples, right, together and said, okay, this is India. This is India. Those of you who took my China, Japan, and India class will know that the idea of India, these were all multiple different kingdoms, states, and the British simply grouped them together as an administrative group. And really the only difference they recognized between them was well, some of you are Hindu and some of you are Muslim, which is why when they left, they broke off Pakistan. So Basically, the nation state grew up in Europe and then was spread around the world via their colonial empires. And so that's why we're where we are now. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about countries and concepts. And especially when we talk about the African states, I believe Nigeria is one of the ones that we're going to do. We are definitely going to talk about that because they had a horrible civil war back in the 1970s, late 1960s, early 1970s, that again was strictly along ethno-linguistic lines. So, okay, so nations and states. Okay. All right. Okay. If I mention something like political economy, for example, political economy is something I'm going to talk about. Political economy, when I talk about that, I mean, what we mean by that, not just me. I did not invent political economy. What I'm talking about there is how governments choose to manage their economies. There is no such thing as a literally free market economy. Every single state, probably in all history, like maybe you could find some kind of libertarian micro-state utopia somewhere, call me if you figure it out, but every state intervenes to manage its economy in some way, and usually with some kind of motivating ideology. In the United States, especially among Republicans, for example, there is this lingering strain of classical liberal, no, we should try to intervene as little as possible. And this is an ideological impulse. If you ask them, they're not going to break out some Cato Institute study showing that, like, actually, what happens here is when we cut these regulations, we see, it's more of an ideological urge. Not that it's wrong, I'm just saying that there are going to be multiple reasons why people say this. Others, like the Germans, tend to be much more pragmatist about it. They don't tend to have much of an ideology behind those type of things. So, but we'll get to that. Nations already constructed. Dependency, good. Just want to make sure I'm hitting all these. Austerity. They talk a lot about austerity in this book because this book was coming out as the European debt crisis was still ongoing. Austerity, then, is basically when you make massive cuts to government spending. So you've all maybe heard, like, the IMF is imposing austerity measures or something like that. That just means that they're demanding strong cuts be made to public spending. So that's what austerity means. We talked about that. Yes. They talk a little bit here about the making of the modern state on page 8. Just some of the interesting things here. And it's kind of cool because all these different things kind of had to line up at the same time for these things to happen. And so I'm just going to read these things to you here. So in 1453, so I talked about 1500 kind of being the period when it happened. In 1453, the Ottoman Turks are going to use gunpowder that had come along the Silk Road from China to blast down the walls of Constantinople. Now, this was what was left of the Eastern Roman Empire, going all the way back to the 5th century when the Germanic tribes overwhelmed the West. The East carried on, right? And so by capturing Constantinople there, all of a sudden, the Europeans were cut off from the Silk Road. Because, and that was that overland trail that was coming from India and China across the Middle East, right? And you basically, the Italian merchants from like Genoa and Venice would load up their ships and bring the goods and spices and all the great things to Europe. Well, when the Ottomans seize control of Constantinople, they start raising the taxes. This prompts Portuguese and Spanish navigators to start trying to go around Africa, and some of them to try and go across the Atlantic. And it's all to avoid these high tariffs. So, interesting. The fall of Constantinople. Right at the same time, 1454, Gutenberg is bringing movable type to Europe. This is hugely important because prior to this, books were incredibly rare. Other than like a Bible, you might go your whole life without seeing a book, and you probably couldn't read. Like, if this was 6 centuries ago, we were all illiterate. Truly, we probably were all illiterate. Even our village priest was probably illiterate. They had this big problem where priests actually didn't know the Mass in Latin. So they would get up there, and first of all, you didn't get to see me, pretend I'm the priest. I would be behind a screen, okay, and you'd kind of all be in the vestibule here. The Protestant Reformation makes a lot of sense when you hear this. So you're all good Catholics, since like the 1300s or something like that. I'm the priest, I'm behind a screen. None of you can understand what I'm saying because number one, you don't know Latin. Number two, I don't speak Latin, so I'm mumbling just. Yes, I'm not joking. It was a huge problem. It was a huge problem. And so, like, yes, it's true. They just were not feeling that connection. They weren't feeling it, you know. And of course, the bishops and stuff were super corrupt, and so was the Pope. And so there you go. I am Catholic, by the way, so I can talk bad about him. So, 1492, Columbus succeeds in getting over there. 1517 of the Protestant Reformation, which this is huge because what's going to happen is the Bible is going to start getting translated into your languages. And this is going to be a huge catalyst of literacy and nationalism. Is because you're going to start getting Bibles written in German and in French. And it's just going to start that literacy ball moving because you need literacy in order to have a high functioning modern bureaucratic state. You need lots of people who can read and follow directions. And the same goes with industrialization. We take it for granted that everyone is like basically numerate and can read and stuff, but like this was not the case, and you just can't operate a complex industrial economy without that. 1602, the first stock exchange opened. This was really important. 1602. Okay, so joint stock corporations. Why are those important? Because they spread out the risk, right? You've got an idea. You think, okay, I hear that there's a ton of perfumes and stuff, and we can get a great price for them here, but it's going to be expensive, and we're going to have to send a ship out. And sometimes ships just don't come back. Very often, a ship sails away, never comes back, lost to the sea, we don't know, got grabbed by pirates, we don't know. All your money's gone, right? All of a sudden, you're like, I don't know that I want to take advantage of this possible opportunity. Well, what if you only had to kick in like 1%? What if you kicked in 1%, and you kicked in 1%, and you kicked in 1%, and then if the voyage is successful, we all get like, 10% or something, 10% return or something like that. This is all very common sense thinking to us, right? But this was revolutionary. It was a revolutionary innovation at the time. So most of the companies that come over, for example, into the North Americas and whatnot, like these were companies that you bought stock in and whatnot. Okay, so success. When I talk about like elites, political elites, which I'm going to talk about like elite drivers of politics, I am talking here about like everything from political decision makers, like the president or a senator, to even like the editor of the Washington Post. Like if you are if anyone who has the power to directly make decisions or to directly influence public opinion, because right, what is the goal of every politician in a democratic system? What's the goal of every politician in every system? If you're in a democratic system, you need the votes, yeah, but let's say not a democratic system. Everyone. What is it?
Be in power.
Be in power, right? I'm so glad no one said like the common good and stuff. I'm so glad you guys are too smart for that kind of stuff. In theory, if we go back to our Aristotle, we will find that the Respublica, the common good, is what we need. No, they're interested in power, right? And so public opinion matters. So you need to put in a call to the Washington Post every once in a while and say, hey, why are you dogging me? Quit doing that. Which they do. And I don't blame them. It's important. So, there you go. The political elites. The masses, that's us. We have votes. But yeah, okay. GDP. You're going to hear me talk about things like GDP, especially when we talk about states moving from authoritarian states to democratic states. There are some scholars who believe that it's once you reach a certain level of wealth that a middle class is created, and they want to say in the government now because their wealth is being taxed, and so they want to say in government. So, and there's actually some really good stuff on that here on page 10 and on page 13. GDP is gross domestic product. It's just a sum of the total goods and services produced in a country in 1 year. It is not a perfect metric. There is no such thing, but it is reasonable. It's just an easy way of kind of getting a snapshot of how the economy is growing. Per capita GDP then is just the GDP divided by the people per capita, is substantially the same per person. So, GDP per capita. Yeah, there's some people, there are scholars who say that like once a country reaches an income threshold of like $6,000 per capita, that like there's a very strong chance of a successful transition to democracy happening. This happened in South Korea. South Korea was a pretty brutal dictatorship until the 1980s. This happened in Taiwan. Taiwan was one of the most repressive police states in the world up until the late 1970s. So it does happen. It can happen, but of course there are other countries where it has not happened. So China is always a huge focus for people who are interested in that. That's called development theory, which basically argues that, again, as you grow a prosperous society, you have this large, wealthy middle class, that they are going to increasingly want a say politically. Because if you're poor, well, the government isn't going to tax you. What is there to tax, right? And so you don't really care. Like, as long as the government isn't conscripting you into the army or, like, you know, being brutal or something, as long as they're ignoring you, you don't really care, right? The government's not bothering you. But as you become richer, all of a sudden the government's going to come knocking. The revenue officials are going to come find you. They're going to start taxing you. And that's going to be annoying. If you haven't started paying taxes yet, believe me, it will be super annoying. And all of a sudden now you're going to want a say in the government. So that's how that works. And it's a neat theory, and as I said, it holds in a lot of cases. A parliament, when I talk about institutions, we tend to think of institutions as like Spring Arbor University. You know, we got our buildings and our campus and stuff. But institutions are really just established rules and relationships and relations of power. When I'm talking about politics, okay, that's what we're talking about there. Constitution, that's the written organization of a country's institutions and the way they all fit together. A parliament, a national assembly that considers and enacts laws. Of course, we have a Congress, so like any kind of national assembly. Parliament is a parliamentary system. We have a Congress, obviously. We have a presidential system. Cabinet, this is in many governments. This is just your top officials, right? This is just your top officials, the ministers of the government. Legitimacy. This is something that we'll mention. The perception that a regime's rule is rightful. A government that loses legitimacy, if a government has a high degree of legitimacy, one of the interesting things, there's been studies about this, they ask, how many police officers do you have per capita? This is one of the ways they assess legitimacy. Meaning that if your country has very, very few police officers and very, very low crime, this is a sign that the government has high legitimacy. Its laws are respected. The people recognize its authority and they obey its laws, right? And whereas if you have a country with very high levels of police and, you know, a good bit of crime, we say maybe the government doesn't have as much legitimacy. There could be other issues going on there, but it's one factor that they look at. The political culture, these are just the values and attitudes of citizens. So if we say like Great Britain historically has a very liberal political culture, meaning they want not a lot of government intervention, they want maximum protection of individual rights, low taxes, things of that nature. Yes, okay. All right, this will be my last thing that I say before I give you guys a break, okay? Does that sound good? Okay. Common political cleavages, okay? And these are also social cleavages. And that's why I think this title is great, because it really the geography, the politics, culture, it all kind of ties into each other. So, common one, the urban-rural divide, right? What is the highest predictor of whether or not a county went Republican or Democrat in this last election? Population density, right? You could pick every single district, like 99.7 something percent, just by knowing what the population density of the district was. Religious struggles. Obviously, again, the United States being a civic nationalism, religion is not something that they fight over a lot. But in other places, for example, Iraq, back during the Second Iraq War, which would have been, golly, you guys were probably born in what, 2002, 2003? Something like that, right? Okay, well, right around that time, the U.S. government toppled Saddam Hussein, and the Shia basically like went on a crazy ethnic cleansing campaign of the Sunnis, and so but yeah, that was some. So religion, geographic location, again, geography can vary. I'm not one of those who's like a strict geographical determinist, but again, it's hard to look at the geography of Ireland and predict with a fairly high degree of confidence that they are going to hate the English, right? Just England is bigger, it's likely going to be a bully, and of course that is what England was, and Scotland, Ireland's going to resent that. Social class. Not a Marxist, but it's important that you understand the general theory there, but this is the idea that the general conflict will be between socioeconomic classes of society. And and of course social class does generally matter, but we've seen in our own case that it's very hard to appeal to people just on the basis of socioeconomic concerns. For example, Joe Biden tried very hard to appeal to the working class, right? To the working class vote, saying, we'll do this, we'll provide you this, do this, and they still didn't vote for him, right? Because other things mattered more. That's where I'll stop for the moment. I'll let you guys take a break. Why don't we reconvene